In the last video, we focused on what protists are and how they live. We defined protists as eukaryotic organisms that aren't plants, animals, or fungi. We also saw that protists are extremely diverse. Some are photosynthetic, some consume food, some absorb nutrients from their environment, and some live as parasites. In this video, we're going to focus on why protists matter. Protists may be small, but they have major effects on our ecosystem, aquatic food webs, symbiotic relationships, nutrient cycling, and human health. As we go through the examples, I'll also mention the modern eukaryotic supergroup each example belongs to. Remember, the goal isn't to memorize every supergroup. The goal is to see that protists are spread across the eukaryotic tree and that they live in many different ways. Let's begin with algae. Algae are photosynthetic organisms that are common in aquatic and moist environments. In this course, when we talk about algae, we're mostly talking about photosynthetic protists. Algae use light energy to make sugar or their own food through photosynthesis. Because of this, many algae act as producers in aquatic ecosystems. They are the base of many aquatic food webs and support life in both oceans and freshwater ecosystems. In the visual at the bottom left of the slide, we see that energy starts with the sun. Photosynthetic algae and other phytoplankton capture this light energy and use it to make sugar. These tiny producers may then be eaten by zooplankton, which are small, drifting, heterotrophic protists or animals. Then the zooplankton may be eaten by small fish. The small fish are then eaten by larger fish and up the chain to larger animals. This means that these tiny photosynthetic protists can support an entire aquatic ecosystem. Now, algae are not all one closely related group, and they're not all microscopic. Some algae are single-celled, like the diatoms and dinoflagellates we learned about. Some form colonies, meaning they live in groups of cells. Others are large and multicellular, like kelp. So when you hear the word algae, don't just picture one type of organism. Algae include many different photosynthetic organisms that can live in oceans, freshwater, or moist environments. Diatoms that we discussed in the first video are a great example of algae. They're photosynthetic, they're found in oceans and freshwater. They're also known for those beautiful glass-like cell walls made of silica. Kelp is a large, multicellular brown algae. Even though it may look like a plant, it's not a true plant. It is photosynthetic, but it's a protist, and it forms underwater forest, which provides both food and a habitat for many marine organisms. It is classified in the supergroup SAR. Red algae that we learned about in the first video is also a multicellular protist. It's found in the supergroup Archaeplastida. Volvox and Cladomonas are examples of green algae. Chlamydomonas is a single-celled green alga, but moves with flagella. Volvox is a colonial green algae, meaning many cells live together in a spherical colony. These algae are also found in the supergroup Archaeplastida. In the next slide, we will look at another type of algae, the dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are in the group SAR. Some dinoflagellates are photosynthetic plankton, but others can be mixotrophic, meaning that they can combine photosynthesis with other ways of getting nutrients. So the big idea here is that photosynthetic protists are not just tiny organisms floating in the water. They are major producers that help support aquatic life. Some algae don't just float freely in the water. They live in close relationships with other organisms. A very important example is the relationship between coral and photosynthetic dinoflagellates. Coral may look like a plant or a rock, but it's actually an animal. We'll talk more about coral later in the semester. Many reef-building corals have tiny photosynthetic dinoflagellates living inside their tissues. These symbiotic dinoflagellates are often called zooxanthellae. This relationship is mutualistic, which means both organisms benefit. The dinoflagellates get a protected place to live, along with access to carbon dioxide, which they need for photosynthesis, and nutrients. In return, the dinoflagellates use photosynthesis to make sugars and other molecules that help feed the coral. In the visual, the coral animal is shown as the host, and the small photosynthetic dinoflagellates are shown living inside the coral tissue. This is a good reminder that some protists are not just part of an ecosystem from the outside, they may live inside other organisms and help them survive. The relationship between coral and photosynthetic dinoflagellates, or zooxanthellae, can be disrupted. Coral bleaching happens when coral becomes stressed. One major cause is unusually warm water, although there are other environmental stressors. When corals are stressed, they may lose or expel the symbiotic dinoflagellates. Because these algae help coral with much of its color, the coral begins to look white. The pale color comes from the coral's calcium carbonate skeleton that shows through the coral tissue. In the visual, the bleached coral appears white because it has lost many of the symbiotic algae. Bleaching doesn't always mean the coral is dead. However, it does mean the coral is stressed and has lost an important food source. In stressful conditions, the coral is much more vulnerable. Coral bleaching shows how important tiny photosynthetic protists can be. When the protist partner is lost, the health of the coral and the reef ecosystem can be affected. Some dinoflagellates can cause harmful algal blooms. You may have heard of one type called a red tide. A red tide happens when certain algae, often dinoflagellates, increase rapidly in number. The water may appear reddish, brownish, or discolored, although not every harmful algal bloom is actually red. Some dinoflagellates can produce toxins. These toxins can harm fish, shellfish, marine mammals, birds, and even sometimes humans. For example, toxins can build up in shellfish, and then people can become sick if we eat contaminated seafood. The important point is not that all dinoflagellates are harmful. Many are not, like the ones we talked about that have symbiotic relationships with coral. The important point is that some protists can have major effects on aquatic ecosystems and even human health when environmental conditions allow them to grow rapidly. This gives us another example of why protists matter. They're not just small organisms in the water. Under certain conditions, they can affect an entire coastal ecosystem. Now let's shift from algae to protozoans. The term protozoan is an older descriptive term that means animal-like protists. Protozoans are usually single-celled and heterotrophic, meaning that they obtain energy by consuming food or by living as parasites. Just like the term algae, the term protozoan is descriptive. It does not represent one perfect modern evolutionary group. Traditionally, protozoans were divided into 4 groups based mostly on how they move. The first group, the amoebids, move using pseudopodia, which are temporary extensions of the cell. The second group is the flagellates. Flagellates move using flagella, which are long, whip-like structures. The third group is the ciliates. Ciliates move using cilia, which are many short-haired structures that beat in unison. The fourth group is the sporozoans, also called apicomplexans. These are usually parasitic, form spores, and don't have any obvious structures for movement as adults. These movement-based groups are useful for descriptions, but they don't perfectly match our modern classification. Protozoans, for example, are spread across different eukaryotic supergroups like Amoebozoa, Excavata, and SAR. Some protozoans are free-living, but as we mentioned, others are parasites. A parasite lives in or on a host and obtains their nutrients from that host. Some parasitic protozoans can cause serious diseases in humans and other animals. In this slide, the visual shows us 3 different ways that disease-causing protozoans can be transmitted. One pathway is by consuming contaminated water. Another is transmission from a mosquito vector. And the third is a transmission by another insect vector. In this case, it's the tsetse fly. We will look at some examples and show how protists can affect human health in different ways. So first, let's look at 2 disease-causing amoebas. So the first, Entamoeba histolytica, is an amoebid protozoan. Remember, amoebas move using what we call pseudopodia, which means false feet. These are temporary extensions of the cell. So Entamoeba histolytica causes Amoebiasis, which is an infection basically in the GI tract. We also might call it amoebic dysentery. And it is usually associated with swallowing contaminated food or water. The next example of a parasitic amoeba is Naegleria fowleri. It is found, you may have seen it in the news. It's typically found in warm freshwater environments, and it's very rare, but if water containing this amoeba parasite goes up the nose, it can travel to the brain and cause a severe infection called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. The meningo is the meninges of the brain, right? Encephalitis has to do with the swelling of the brain. So this infection doesn't happen when you swallow the water. It happens when it comes up the nose. The interesting thing about Naegleria fowleri is that it can also have a flagellated stage in addition to being an amoeba. So if we compare these, they're both amoebid, but they're not transmitted in the same way. One through food and water that's contaminated, one through warm fresh water entering the nose. Now let's look at a couple of disease-causing flagellates. Both of these examples are in the supergroup excavata. So flagellates, as a reminder, move using flagella, these long whip-like structures. So on the left, we see Giardia, which is a flagellated protozoan that causes giardiasis, which is another intestinal illness. It also spreads when people ingest Giardia from contaminated water, food, surfaces, or objects. On the right, we see Trypanosoma is a flagellated protozoan, but it spreads differently. So some species of Trypanosoma are transmitted by insect vectors. So an example would be African sleeping sickness, which is caused by Trypanosoma brucei. This one is spread by the tsetse fly. Another example not pictured here is Chagas disease, which is caused by another flagellated protozoan called Trypanosoma cruzi. It is spread by an insect vector, the kissing bug. What happens in this case, the insect will bite a person's face and then it will defecate near the wound. And the infection occurs when the parasite the feces of the parasite is rubbed into the bite or the eye or the mouth when someone touches their face or scratches. So our next example is the protist that causes malaria. You may think that malaria is caused by mosquitoes, but that's not correct. It's actually caused by a protist. The mosquito is just the vector that transmits it to humans. So according to the World Health Organization, in 2024, there were an estimated about 282 million cases of malaria worldwide and a little over 600,000 deaths that occurred because of malaria. So malaria is caused by the protozoan Plasmodium. This is, if we're talking about the way that we traditionally would have categorized it, we would have said it was a sporozoan. In our modern classification, it belongs to the supergroup SAR. Unlike the amoebids we look at and the flagellates, sporozoans don't have obvious movement structures as adults. They do form spores, and they are usually parasitic, and as we'll see in this example, have very complex life cycles. So the Plasmodium protist is transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito, and it can infect humans. So in order for it to complete its life cycle, it requires both the human host and the mosquito host. In the mosquito, fertilization occurs in the mosquito gut, and the oocysts develop. So an oocyst is a stage where the parasite develops and produces many what are called sporozoites. These are the infective stage that can be transmitted to humans. So the sporozoites will migrate to the mosquito's salivary glands, and then when the mosquito bites a human, it injects the sporozoites into our bloodstream. These then travel to our liver, where the parasite begins to develop. Next, it will infect red blood cells and multiply, which contributes to the symptoms of malaria. Some of these parasites then develop into what are called gametocytes, which are the sexual forms of the parasite. When another mosquito bites the infected person, then it can take up the gametocytes and continue the cycle. In the lab section, you're going to explore the complex life cycle of Plasmodium between humans and mosquitoes. Protists also are important because they help recycle nutrients. Slime molds are often described as fungus-like protists because they're commonly found in moist environments with decaying material like leaf litter or rotting logs. Even though they may look like fungi, slime molds are not true fungi. Many slime molds belong to the supergroup Amoebozoa. Unlike fungi, they don't have chitin in their cell walls, and many feed by engulfing food particles more like amoebas. This is one reason that many slime molds are classified with Amoebozoa rather than with fungi. Plasmodial slime molds form one large multinucleate mass like you see pictured here. There are cellular slime molds that can live as individual cells, but then they can aggregate to form this multinucleate mass when food is scarce. Both can help recycle nutrients in moist environments. In the visual, the slime mold is shown growing across a decaying material. This environment is important because slime molds are often associated with organic matter that is breaking down. By helping break down this organic material, it recycles nutrients, and these fungus-like protists play an important role in ecosystems. So let's review some of the things that we've talked about in this video today. Diatoms and other algae are important because they are photosynthetic producers. They capture energy from sunlight and help support aquatic food webs. The photosynthetic dinoflagellates are important because they live in symbiosis with coral, and this relationship helps support coral reef ecosystems and the many organisms that live there. Slime molds are important because they help recycle nutrients in moist environments. And we also discussed several disease-causing protozoans such as Giardia, Trypanosoma, and Plasmodium, and we saw how these can be a negative impact on human health. So, protists can be producers, they can live in symbiosis, they can recycle nutrients, and they can also be parasites. So, summarizing what we've learned in these two videos, protists are not just one simple group of organisms. There are diverse eukaryotes that are not plants, not animals, and not fungi. As a quick recap, algae are photosynthetic organisms, and they support aquatic food webs. The photosynthetic dinoflagellates have a symbiotic relationship with coral, and when that relationship breaks down, we can see coral bleaching. We saw some examples of protozoans, which are the animal-like protists that were traditionally grouped by movement. So the amoebids with pseudopodia, flagellates move with flagella, ciliates with cilia, and the sporozoans, which are usually parasitic, don't have obvious adult movement structures. We saw some examples of disease-causing organisms like Giardia, Trypanosoma, and Plasmodium. And finally, we ended with the nutrient-recycling fungus-like protist, the slime mold. So keep in mind, these are important organisms in ecosystems. They participate in symbiotic relationships. They can recycle nutrients, and they can also be parasitic organisms and affect human health.